Hi guys, I'm October, but you can call me Toby. Thanks for coming to spend some time with me today. I just want to run through some tips and tricks and things that I've picked up in the last few months doing so much sculpting and crochet, since those are two of the main things I do on the channel. And I've picked up lots of little things here and there that I think make these processes easier. So let's go through those today. One of the probably biggest things that I've found has improved my crocheting is using a yarn winder, and I opted to get an electric one because I didn't want to be sitting here winding yarn when I could just very slightly, a little bit more money, I could have it done electrically. Using a yarn winder in combination with a yarn holder, I have found this to be so very helpful. I'll put links down below to the tools and things that I got off of Amazon or other stores, but the yarn holders my brother actually made for me. He 3D printed them, he modeled them up and 3D printed them for Christmas. The only downside to them is that some of my yarn balls are kind of weighty, and when you're using it, it has a tendency to tip. Very easily resolved by just placing like a book, an ebook reader, your phone, just something on the base here to weight that down. But one of the reasons this has been so handy is that it's so very portable. I've got stitch markers on the top. They never really come off unless I take them off, just because they're quite firm. If you are using a hook that is metallic and does not have, it could be plastic, but that doesn't have one of these overly grippy ergonomic handles, it's quite simple to pop it into the yarn. This yarn's a little looser in the middle, but that's fairly firmly in there too. Like, it's not just gonna tip out. So this has been super handy. I can have these pre-balled up. So I've had a white one sitting here on my desk for different projects for a while. I've got a merino sitting over on my multi hold stand, which looks like this. So this one holds 4. So I've got my merino yarn that I love to use for my granny squares and learning new stitches on here. My brother designed this as well. So this combination of being able to yarn wind and then put the wool on something that it pulls evenly and smoothly from has been a game changer for me. I used to just work with wool like this, but I'm not a center puller. I don't think I'm bad at it. I just don't think I have any luck. So I always work from the outside of the yarn, and my yarn would just kind of flop around. If I popped it in a bag to take crochet on the go, it would usually just become a big mess and I'd spend a lot of my time detangling. I also have a cat, and you know, they do love a ball of yarn. Yeah, this has been an absolute game changer. I find it's easier to use overall. It's easier also to take on the go. The yarn winder is really simple to use, and I've used it with several different wools now, a cotton, a merino, and the chenille, a couple different types of chenille yarn too, because I've got a few different brands here. And I haven't had any trouble with the chenilles like losing their fluff. You just weave it through. I find the trickiest part is actually getting it started. So I like to hold that bit for that starting and then just turn it up and let it go. Yeah, it's just been a game changer. So I can sit here and work on something so long as my yarn ball is ideally like not flopping all over the place while this is happening. Those are some of the main things with crochet that I have found to be super helpful. Speaking of the chenille yarns, one of the game changers I have found is to actually remove the yarn off the end and tie a knot in the thread that holds the chenille yarn together. From what I've found, this has been very, very helpful in stopping my overall yarn from loosening and shedding while I'm using it. That was something I was really struggling with to start with. Tiny little knot into there, and that makes all the difference. I find the thread that holds it all together, it can't loosen and unwind from this end point, and the tension on the rest of it holds steady. I just find there's so much less shedding whilst I'm using it if I tie off the ends. So I tie off the end before I yarn wind, and then I tie off the end that I'm starting to work with as well. And whenever I cut a tail, I will tie off the ends of that as well, just to prevent any loss of tension in the yarn itself over time, and I don't want that to shed over time either. So I found that to be a huge game changer. The other one that I found so helpful, because when I first started using chenille yarns, making magic rings, I love working with magic rings. I know that everyone has an opinion on if they prefer to, I think it's the 2-chain method where you work back into your original chain as your magic ring, or if you want to actually do a magic ring, my starting loops when I'm doing a chain. I do that from the magic ring positioning as well now, because I just find it really easy to do that with my fingers and pull that into a slip knot. The other thing I found amazing, because I like using magic rings, is to use an acrylic yarn particularly when I'm doing small magic rings, like on the legs, ends of the legs, the end of the tail in particular, to get the chenille yarn to pull into a magic ring nice and tightly closed. I just find it sheds like mad. It rips, it tears, it doesn't hold together. It's just a lot harder to use than using an acrylic yarn over the same, if you've got it, or a very, very similar color. I cannot see the yarn in any of the magic rings I've done. And sometimes I'll even use acrylic yarn to close a magic ring if I'm having trouble with yarn shedding. And once it sheds, then all that tension just of pulling it tight, it just seems to make the threads so much weaker. And I find a lot of the time they just snap, which can be kind of detrimental if you've just finished a big piece. Using the acrylic yarn is awesome. I've also found in using it to sew things together, it pulls through more smoothly. Again, there's nothing to shed, and the yarn itself is a lot thicker than these couple of strands of cotton or whatever this is holding this together. So there's a very, very tiny, almost no likelihood of it snapping if something is, roughly played with by like a small child. So I'm finding that I'm doing a lot of my stitching things together using acrylic yarn, and then I just gently and smoothly, if any of the sewing is showing in the acrylic yarn, like for instance on this dog, the acrylic yarn I used was a slightly different brown, you can see there, but like on the back legs it's not visible. You can't see that when the back leg's in proper position, so I wasn't worried about that. On spots like the neck and these front legs and the tail, I just went over it with the chenille yarn, like a piece of the chenille, just very gently looping that over the spots and weaving that in. So instead of it having to do all the work of actually holding pieces together, it's kind of just a coverage of the acrylic, which is very smoothly holding pieces together. Coming up with this pattern took quite a while. I had very specific leg shape in mind and quite a specific body shape and head shape I wanted to do. I wanted to do the snout attached, which so far I hadn't quite got the hang of how to create the shape to do that. And in doing that, I had to do a test piece to work it up before I did the tutorial. So you can see this guy is more of a sausage dog than anything else, although his face does not look it. His face is quite short snouted. But yes, the legs, the body, the head, I think the ears were the only thing I worked up, and they worked the first time around. It got created and frogged and created and frogged so many times, and chenille yarns aren't really made for frogging like that. They kind of go to pieces quite literally. Something I found that helped a lot with having to frog chenille, because I did not want to be wasting a heap of yarn, was using a much smaller hook. A lot of the time I think I grabbed a 3, or this is a 2.5. It's a lot smaller than my 5mm, which I use with the chenille yarns. And I would just go along whichever row I was working on. I would just unhook all of the top loops of that row. And then when I pulled the yarn, it would come out so much smoother for that row. It was kind of just looped through at that point. So I found doing that, I had a lot less loss of fiber and was able to continue using the same pieces without them getting too thin. And I didn't want my test piece to be full of holes, because I wouldn't have a good idea of how to improve upon it if that happened. So any of the products like the yarn winder, some of my hooks that I have, like a good set of hooks that I got, and because I needed some larger ones for when I was doing some blankets. Pretty sure this was the kit. Came with a nice little bag, which has been very, very handy for on the go. It's full of hooks and tape measures and stitch markers and scissors and things, but that's been excellent as well. So I will link those things down below. So now that I've run you through some of the tips and tricks and things that I've learned in terms of crochet and wool chenille, I'd like to have a little chat about some of the stuff that I've found with sculpting. So I do love sculpting, and I so far prefer to use polymer clay for the ease of being able to bake it and kind of save states of work. A downside is I do not have a pasta roller, so I'm having to roll this by hand to get it to a workable state. So one of the things that I have found super helpful has actually been petroleum jelly. This has been a game changer in terms of workability of the clay. So depending on how much you add, I'd say go adding small bits at a time, but I tend to rip off like a layer of clay, add Vaseline to it, and then depending on how hard the clay is, I'll either roll straight away to get that pressure onto it, or you can start kneading it with your hands if they're just little bits that can can kind of be worked. The warmth of your hands will help work the petroleum jelly in and get the clay to a kneadable, workable state. The more you add, softer of a consistency the clay gets to. If you add too much, your clay may not harden correctly when you bake it. So I add it slowly until I get the clay to a point where it's very workable. Sometimes I want it a touch softer, sometimes I want a touch firmer. That's just something I read. Another thing that I have found quite helpful, getting this set of silicone brushes, and I will link these down below. They were not expensive. The bottom ends are different size ball tip, which has been really helpful as well, actually more helpful than I thought they would be. They've been really handy. Another one with clay is polymer clay I'm talking. Once it's baked, you can sand it. So that's been really handy for things like my Quebec seedling and my cactus. He's in a bit of a state after my son got his hands on him. But yes, for things like these, which are cubes, having sandpaper available was really great. But on top of that, having a Dremel with sanding tips has been really, really good because you can put all of the different heads on it. Those are my tips and tricks that I have learned over the last, 6-ish months being on here and doing so much crochet, so much sculpting. Those are the things I've picked up and learned. If you've got any other tips, tricks, pop them in the comments below. I love hearing about things and trying them out. I'll see you next week. I hope some of these were useful. Have a great day. Bye.